On June 9, 1972, a helicopter lifted off in bad weather over the central highlands of Vietnam. Inside was a civilian. No general stars, no combat command on paper. But when South Vietnamese units broke, he was the one calling airstrikes. When artillery stalled, he was the one pushing it forward. His name was Paul Vann. He had spent 10 years fighting a war inside a war, not just against the North Vietnamese, but against his own side's lies. He believed the war could be won. The question is whether the war ever deserved that belief. Paul Vann was born in 1924 in Norfolk, Virginia. He did not grow up with comfort or influence. His mother worked hard, money was thin, stability was not guaranteed. From early on, he learned that respect had to be taken, not given. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces during World War II. He trained as a pilot, but the war ended before he saw combat. When the shooting stopped, he stayed in uniform. For many men, the Army was a job. For Vann, it was structure. It offered order, rank, and a ladder to climb. He was intelligent and driven. He read constantly. He studied tactics and history. He believed that wars could be understood if you were disciplined enough to study them. But ambition ran close to insecurity. He needed recognition. He needed to prove himself. His personal life never matched the image he projected. His marriage was unstable. He was demanding, often controlling. He pushed people the way he pushed himself. Success mattered. Appearances mattered. As an officer in the 1950s, he built a reputation as energetic and forceful. He did not tolerate laziness. He did not hide his opinions. That made him useful. It also made him difficult. By the early 1960s, the United States was increasing its advisory presence in South Vietnam. Washington believed the communist insurgency there could be contained with training and equipment. It was not yet America's war, not officially. Vann volunteered. He saw it as a proving ground, a place where clarity could exist. Guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency, political struggle. This was not a battlefield of massed armies. It was a test of leadership and will. He believed discipline and competence could solve most problems. He believed that if units were trained properly and led honestly, they would fight properly and report honestly. In 1962, he arrived in Vietnam as a lieutenant colonel assigned to advise the South Vietnamese Army. He expected inefficiency. He did not expect what he was about to see. In 1962, Paul Vann was assigned to advise the 7th Division of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam in the Mekong Delta. The region was flat, wet, and cut by canals. Control of that ground meant control of villages. Control of villages meant control of the population. On paper, the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, had the advantage. They had American helicopters, radios, artillery, and intelligence support. They outnumbered local Viet Cong units. They were supposed to be improving every month. But from his first weeks in the field, Vann saw a gap between reports and reality. Operations were slow, commanders hesitated, units avoided decisive contact. When contact did happen, it was often cautious to the point of paralysis. Officers worried about casualties. Promotions were tied to political loyalty, not battlefield skill. Initiative was rare. Then came January 2, 1963. The 7th Division moved against a Viet Cong force near the hamlet of Ap Bac. American advisors believed the enemy could be trapped and destroyed. Helicopters inserted troops. Armored personnel carriers advanced across open ground. Firepower was available. The plan should have worked. Instead, the South Vietnamese units stalled. Some elements refused to move under fire. Opportunities to flank were ignored. Helicopters were shot down as they tried to reinforce pinned units. The Viet Cong, though outnumbered and lightly equipped, held their ground and then slipped away in good order. It was not a catastrophic defeat in numbers, but it was a warning. Vann was furious, not because the enemy resisted, but because his own side failed to press its advantage. He believed the battle proved that the insurgents were disciplined and determined. More troubling, he believed ARVN leadership lacked urgency. After the fight, official summaries described progress. They emphasized enemy losses. They highlighted equipment used and positions taken. Vann had watched the battle unfold. He believed the real story was hesitation, fear of casualties, and a command structure unwilling to adapt under pressure. He argued that body counts did not matter if the enemy chose when to fight and when to leave. Territory briefly occupied did not equal control. He also saw something deeper. The Viet Cong were not just fighters hiding in the jungle. They had support networks inside villages. They moved through areas that government forces technically controlled. That meant the war was not simply military, it was political. If local farmers believed the insurgents would return at night, then daytime sweeps solved nothing. Vann began writing blunt assessments. He argued that the South Vietnamese army needed leaders who would accept risk. He argued that American headquarters was too optimistic. He warned that reporting systems rewarded good news. His criticism did not stay private. American journalists covering the advisory effort were already skeptical of official briefings. Some had begun traveling outside Saigon to see conditions firsthand. Vann spoke openly about what he believed was happening in the Delta. He did not leak secrets. He challenged conclusions. Inside the command structure, this was dangerous. The senior American officer in Vietnam, General Paul Harkins, maintained that the campaign was making steady progress. Washington wanted reassurance that limited involvement was working. Public confidence mattered. Vann believed honesty mattered more. By mid-1963, he had become known as one of the most outspoken advisors in country. To some officers, he was reckless. To others, he was the only one saying out loud what many suspected. He had come to Vietnam believing discipline and clarity could fix a struggling ally. Now he was beginning to suspect the problem was larger than training. It was a system built to protect itself from bad news. By 1963, John Paul Vann was no longer just an advisor in the field. He had become a problem. His reports challenged the official narrative coming out of Saigon. Senior commanders described steady improvement. Metrics showed rising enemy casualties and expanding government control. Briefings in Washington reflected confidence. Vann saw something different. He believed success was being measured the wrong way. Counting bodies did not prove villages were secure. Large search operations did not prove loyalty. A unit that avoided risk during contact could still file a clean report afterward. He began speaking candidly to reporters who were already questioning the gap between battlefield claims and what they witnessed outside the capital. Among them were David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan. They were young, aggressive, and skeptical of official optimism. Vann did not see himself as undermining the war effort. He believed public understanding depended on accurate information. If strategy was flawed, it needed correction. If South Vietnamese leadership was ineffective, it needed reform. Silence, in his view, only guaranteed deeper failure. But the Army operated on hierarchy. Criticism that stayed inside formal channels could be managed. Criticism that reached the press could not. His superiors viewed his openness as disloyal. To them, he was feeding doubt at a time when unity was essential. Tension followed him home. In 1963, while still in uniform, Vann faced serious allegations involving misconduct with a minor in the United States. An Army investigation confirmed inappropriate conduct. Rather than face court-martial, he resigned his commission. The circumstances ended his military career abruptly. The scandal rarely appeared in public accounts at the time. Within the institution, however, it closed doors permanently. Whatever influence he might have had as a rising officer disappeared overnight. He left active duty with a damaged reputation and unfinished arguments. Yet something else remained. His analysis of the war did not change. He still believed the insurgency could be countered, but only if corruption was confronted, local leadership strengthened, and the population protected consistently. He argued that the war's center of gravity was not enemy main forces, but political legitimacy. He was no longer wearing a uniform, but Vietnam was not finished with him. Over the next 2 years, the conflict escalated dramatically. American combat troops would arrive in large numbers. Air campaigns would expand. The war he had tried to shape as an advisor was becoming something much larger. For most officers forced out under similar circumstances, the story would have ended there. For John Paul Vann, it did not. He still believed he understood the problem better than the men now running the war, and he was determined to prove it. In 1965, John Paul Vann returned to Vietnam. He did not return in uniform. He came back as a civilian working for the U.S. Agency for International Development. The war had changed since his first tour. American combat troops were now deploying in large numbers. The advisory mission had expanded into direct involvement. Vann's new role focused on pacification, strengthening local government control in rural areas. The concept was simple in theory. Secure villages, build trust, support local officials, and deny insurgents access to people and resources. If the population believed the government could protect them, the insurgency would weaken. Earlier attempts at rural reform had faltered. Programs were rolled out quickly, often without sustained protection. Some villages were fortified and then abandoned. Others were declared secure on paper, while insurgent influence continued after dark. Vann believed the failure was not in the concept, but the execution. He argued that clearing an area meant little without staying power. Security had to be permanent. Local forces needed consistent leadership. Intelligence had to come from villagers who felt safe cooperating. Pacification, in his view, was a long-term commitment, not a headline. In 1967, a new structure combined military and civilian efforts under one umbrella: Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, CORDS. It was placed within the broader American command but focused on rural stability rather than large-scale search operations. The program fell under the authority of William Colby, who believed coordination was essential. Vann thrived in this environment. He moved through provinces, evaluated leadership, and pushed for practical changes. His earlier bluntness remained, but now he operated with more autonomy. He developed strong working relationships with some South Vietnamese provincial leaders while openly criticizing others. He did not hesitate to recommend removal of officials he viewed as ineffective or corrupt. That directness earned both respect and resistance. Unlike traditional military commanders, Vann's authority came from influence rather than rank. He persuaded, he pressured, he bypassed obstacles when possible. He relied on field visits rather than briefings. If he thought a district chief was misreporting security conditions, he went to the district himself. He also adapted. While he had once focused on criticizing inflated reports, he now concentrated on building local capacity. He pushed for better training of territorial forces. He emphasized intelligence networks inside villages. He supported targeted operations against insurgent infrastructure rather than broad sweeps through empty terrain. By the late 1960s, he had become one of the most experienced Americans in country who understood both military operations and rural governance. Younger officers sought his advice. Senior officials tolerated him because results in certain provinces improved under tighter coordination. The war continued to escalate around him. But in the countryside, Vann believed there was still a narrow path to stability if effort remained consistent and leadership remained honest. He was no longer trying to reform the army from inside. He was trying to shape the war from its edges outward. In January 1968, the war changed again. During the Lunar New Year ceasefire, Communist forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. Cities, provincial capitals, and even parts of Saigon were hit. The offensive became known as Tet. The scale surprised American and South Vietnamese leadership. Intelligence had suggested enemy activity, but not a nationwide surge of that size. Images of fighting inside urban centers traveled quickly through American media. Public confidence began to shift. Paul Vann viewed Tet differently from many observers. Militarily, the offensive inflicted heavy losses on North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units. They exposed themselves in conventional assaults. In many places, they failed to hold ground. Government forces, reinforced by American units, eventually regained control of contested areas. Politically, however, the impact was severe. Tet showed that the insurgency could strike almost anywhere. It undercut earlier claims that progress was steady and irreversible. Even though the attackers suffered high casualties, the shock damaged credibility. Vann believed the response mattered more than the surprise. He argued that if the government used the moment to tighten local security and expand control in rural areas, the offensive could mark a turning point. The insurgent infrastructure had been strained. Rebuilding would take time. But he also recognized the growing gap between events in Vietnam and opinion in the United States. Television coverage focused on street fighting and embassy walls breached. The narrative at home shifted from cautious optimism to doubt. Vann did not interpret Tet as proof the war was unwinnable. He saw it as proof that the struggle was still political at its core. Urban attacks grabbed headlines, but the long-term contest remained in villages and districts. If local governance improved and security remained steady, he believed insurgent influence could erode. What concerned him more was American impatience. Large unit sweeps and heavy firepower could blunt offensives, but they did not replace stable local authority. If U.S. policy shifted toward rapid disengagement without leaving durable institutions behind, earlier gains would evaporate. By 1968, American troop levels had peaked. Domestic protests were increasing. Political leaders in Washington debated future commitments. The war's trajectory was no longer shaped only by battlefield outcomes. Vann remained focused on implementation. He spent less time arguing with journalists and more time evaluating district-level performance. He believed consistency, not dramatic offenses, would determine the result. Tet forced a national reassessment. For Vann, it reinforced a conviction he had held since his first tour. Headlines did not decide wars. Structures did, and those structures were still fragile. By the early 1970s, Paul Vann held more influence in Vietnam than many uniformed officers. He was assigned to oversee pacification efforts in 2 corps, a vast region that included mountains, coastal plains, and key supply routes. The terrain was complex, so was the chain of command. American forces were gradually drawing down under Vietnamization. The policy meant to shift responsibility to South Vietnamese units. Vann operated inside that transition. He coordinated civilian programs, advised military leaders, and moved between provincial headquarters with unusual freedom. Though technically a civilian employee, he directed resources that affected combat operations. Helicopter lifts, air support requests, intelligence sharing, his recommendations carried weight. He was not bound by traditional military career concerns. He did not compete for promotion. He did not rotate out after a standard tour. That continuity gave him leverage. When ARVN commanders hesitated, Vann pressed them. When provincial officials underperformed, he documented it. He demanded better reporting, not optimistic summaries. He had learned from his first tour that numbers without context meant little. The North Vietnamese Army was also changing its approach. As American ground forces decreased, conventional formations began testing South Vietnamese strength. The conflict was shifting from insurgency-heavy operations toward larger unit engagements in some regions. Vann adjusted accordingly. He supported expanded training for ARVN units and emphasized combined arms coordination. Air power, especially U.S. tactical aircraft and B-52 strikes, remained a decisive factor. He understood that air support could compensate for weakness in maneuver, but only if requests were timely and accurate. In 1972, the North launched what became known as the Easter Offensive. Unlike earlier campaigns focused on guerrilla pressure, this was a large-scale conventional assault across multiple fronts. Tanks rolled across the demilitarized zone. Artillery pounded defensive positions. In 2 Corps, pressure mounted quickly. Vann responded by integrating civilian advisory authority with military coordination. He worked directly with South Vietnamese commanders, sometimes from forward positions. He pushed for aggressive use of airstrikes to blunt armored advances. He monitored supply routes and reinforced threatened districts. His style remained direct. He could be sharp with officers who stalled. He favored movement and initiative over caution. He believed hesitation created openings that were difficult to close. Within the American system, some still viewed him as unconventional, but in the field, results mattered. Provinces under tighter coordination showed stronger defensive responses. Units that previously faltered began holding lines longer under sustained attack. By this stage of the war, Vann's authority did not come from rank insignia. It came from experience and access. He understood the region, knew the players, and moved quickly. The Easter Offensive would test everything he had argued for over a decade: local resilience, coordinated support, and leadership under pressure. 2 Corps was about to be the center of that test, and Vann intended to be in the middle of it. In the spring of 1972, the town of An Lộc became one of the most dangerous places in Southeast Asia. Located north of Saigon near the Cambodian border, it sat along Highway 13, an important route for movement and supply. When the North Vietnamese Army launched its offensive into 3 Corps and surrounding regions, armored columns and heavy artillery pushed toward the town with the clear objective of capturing it. Unlike earlier insurgent campaigns built around ambush and infiltration, this was open warfare. Tanks advanced across roads, artillery batteries fired sustained barrages, entire regiments maneuvered in daylight. South Vietnamese defenders inside An Lộc were outnumbered and under constant pressure. Shelling destroyed buildings, supply lines were cut, reinforcements struggled to reach the city. Paul Vann moved toward the crisis. Operating from forward positions, he coordinated support across civilian and military channels. His authority allowed him to move quickly between advisory roles and operational influence. He worked closely with South Vietnamese commanders while maintaining direct communication with American air assets. Air power became the deciding factor. Close air support missions struck advancing armor. B-52 bombers delivered heavy strikes against concentrated enemy formations outside the perimeter. Tactical aircraft targeted artillery positions when coordinates were confirmed. Every delay in coordination risked collapse. Vann pressed for speed. He flew frequently between command posts, sometimes landing under threat of incoming fire. He monitored defensive lines, assessed morale, and urged aggressive countermeasures when opportunities appeared. His presence was visible. Officers inside the besieged town knew he was engaged. The defenders held, but barely. North Vietnamese units attempted repeated assaults. Armor probed weak points. Artillery sought to break the will of troops and civilians alike. The destruction inside An Lộc was extensive. Buildings burned, streets cratered, casualties mounted. Yet the perimeter did not collapse. South Vietnamese units, supported by concentrated airstrikes, stabilized their positions. Anti-tank weapons proved effective at close range. Air-delivered resupply kept ammunition and medical support flowing, despite ground routes being cut. Vann viewed the defense as proof of a larger argument. Properly supported, ARVN units could withstand conventional pressure. With coordinated leadership and sustained backing, they could resist without direct American ground intervention. The battle continued for weeks. Gradually, the attacking formations lost momentum. Airstrikes disrupted supply lines. Concentrated bombing forced repositioning. The cost of repeated assaults rose. By early summer, the immediate threat of capture diminished. An Lộc remained in government hands. For Vann, it represented validation. Years of insisting that local forces could stand with the right structure behind them seemed, in that moment, justified. On June 9, 1972, while traveling by helicopter in poor weather conditions in the Central Highlands, Vann's aircraft crashed. He was killed instantly. The town he had fought to support still stood. The broader war remained unresolved. In the aftermath, many described him as the most influential civilian in Vietnam. Others remembered his earlier clashes and personal controversies. Few denied his intensity. He had spent a decade immersed in the conflict, first as a critic, then as a builder, finally as a coordinator during one of the war's largest conventional assaults. An Locq survived. John Paul Vann did not. After John Paul Vann's death, the fighting did not stop. The Easter offensive slowed, then stabilized. American airpower continued to play a major role through the remainder of 1972. Negotiations in Paris moved forward. By 1973, U.S. combat forces were gone. 2 years later, South Vietnam fell. That outcome shaped how many people judged Vann's legacy. Some argued that his model depended too heavily on American air support. Without it, South Vietnamese units faced severe shortages in fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment. When Congress reduced funding after 1973, the balance shifted. Structural weaknesses that had been masked by external backing reappeared. Others pointed out that local security programs in certain provinces had shown measurable improvement during peak coordination. District-level reporting became more consistent. Territorial forces performed more effectively in some regions than they had a decade earlier. These gains suggested that reform, while uneven, was not impossible. The central question remained timing. Could earlier emphasis on population security have altered the trajectory? If corruption had been addressed more aggressively in the early 1960s, would rural control have hardened before conventional invasions intensified? Or were political divisions inside South Vietnam too deep to sustain long-term stability? Vann believed competence could narrow those gaps. He trusted disciplined leadership more than broad strategy shifts. His focus stayed on execution. Who held the ground? Who trained local units? Who verified reports firsthand? In 1988, journalist Neil Sheehan published A Bright Shining Lie, a detailed account centered on Vann's career. The book portrayed him as complex, driven, insightful, flawed, ambitious, and often correct in diagnosing institutional problems. It did not simplify him into hero or villain. History rarely offers clean verdicts. Vann's record shows a man who identified weaknesses early and tried to address them through direct action. It also shows that structural reform inside a divided state required more than energy and clarity. He argued that wars are lost when leaders refuse to confront uncomfortable realities. Vietnam suggests that even when those realities are confronted, they may not be enough. Before we end, there's something that needs to be stated clearly. In the late 1950s, while stationed in West Germany, John Paul Vann had a sexual relationship with a 15-year-old girl. She was the daughter of a U.S. enlisted soldier. An Army investigation substantiated the misconduct. Vann was in his mid-30s at the time. Rather than face court-martial under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Vann resigned his commission in 1963. That decision ended his Army career. At the time, the age of consent in West Germany was 14, but American service members overseas were still subject to U.S. military law. Under the UCMJ, Vann faced serious charges, including conduct unbecoming an officer. The Army allowed him to resign instead of standing trial. This is not speculation. It is based on Army records later examined by journalist Neil Sheehan in his book, A Bright Shining Lie. There is no credible dispute about the basic facts. This part of his life cannot be separated from his story. It permanently closed the door to advancement in uniform. It also changed the direction of his career. After resigning, he returned to Vietnam as a civilian. In that role, he operated outside the normal Army promotion system. He had more freedom. He had fewer formal limits. But that freedom came after serious misconduct. Vann forces historians to wrestle with something uncomfortable. Can someone be operationally correct about a war and personally unfit for command? The answer, in his case, appears to be yes. His strategic insights remain widely respected. His personal conduct remains indefensible. That duality is why he remains one of the most studied American figures in Vietnam. If we're going to tell the story honestly, we have to tell all of it. He died in the same country that had defined him. No rank on his collar, no division under his command. Yet when a city was on the edge, he was the one in the air, pushing decisions forward. John Paul Vann believed the war could be fixed if the truth was faced head on. Not managed, not softened, faced. He fought incompetence harder than he fought the enemy. Maybe that was the real battle. Vietnam did not end the way he hoped. But for a decade, he tried to force the system to look in the mirror. Some wars are lost in the field. Others are lost in the briefing room. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.